Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Women in GIS webinar based on the Esri Press series, Women in GIS. We're hosting this in partnership with WeCan, Esri's Women Enablement and Career Advance Network. I'm Stacy Cree. I'm an acquisitions editor at Esri Press. I'm one of the writers of the book, along with my coworkers, Claudia Neighbor and Alicia Tornetta. And helping me out today behind the scenes are Madeline Shurin and Margot Bourne with Esri's WeCan organization. A little bit about WeCan. It's an employee resource group at Esri focused on enabling women of all backgrounds to achieve their goals and build strong careers. To learn about other external facing events that they host, you can follow them on Instagram at WeCan_Esri. So today we have 4 distinguished speakers. We've got Dr. Catherine Nakalembe, Dr. Susan Wolfinbarger, Dr. Veronica Velez, and Rhiannan Price, all of whom we've featured in this newest book, Women in GIS Volume 2, Stars of Spatial Science. And that's available for purchase at your favorite online realtor, so go check it out. Each of these women have generously contributed to the book and have helped us to inspire and educate so many about GIS and women's roles in the STEM field. So I'm really proud and honored that they've decided to share some of their story and their work with us this morning. So before we start, you'll notice that the chat window is at the bottom of your screens. If you have any questions during the presentations, please type them into the chat window. We'll be taking about 30 minutes at the end of all 4 presentations to ask our speakers questions. So our first presenter is Dr. Catherine Nakalembe. Dr. Catherine Nakalembe has broad interests, including agriculture and food security, as well as early warning and assessment of disasters with remote sensing. She is the NASA Harvest Africa Program Lead and serves as the Agriculture and Food Security Thematic Lead on the NASA Server Applied Science team. Catherine works with national ministries of agriculture in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and Mali. She leads capacity building in the use of Earth observations, remote sensing, and electronic field data for agriculture monitoring in support of food security in the GeoGlam context. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Stacey, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here and share my story with these amazing women as part of this book, which is a really great opportunity to inspire other women who, might have backgrounds that are not so different from mine. I will try in the next 10 minutes to just share about my story and how I've been using GIS and remote sensing in my work, and hopefully that will inspire other people to our field and others to do more and dream big. I like this quote that I have on the slides, that the size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them, and if your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough. Growing up in Kampala, Uganda, have these pictures from when I was little. I don't think I, was a dreamer or ever dreamed a lot, because I didn't have a lot of role models who were, women who were doing science. And so a lot of what I learned is from my parents and my sisters, and it was mostly about courage and working hard and, appreciating what you have. I loved doing all sorts of projects, and the picture on the right is me. At that time, I was interested in crocheting, and once I finished a project, I would just stop and then start something new. Sitting with my cousin and my niece and sorry, my nephew and my little sister. About the reason why I said that I always liked doing projects, and I would start a new one. I think it comes from my dad. My dad is a mechanic. He still does fix cars up to this day. And during this lockdown time, he's actually spending most of his time trying to fix an unfixable car. And I think I get that from my dad about trying to figure out how to fix something. And one of the other things that I did a lot when I was young is we played badminton with my sisters. The one on the picture on the top left is with me and my little sister. I think we just come back from school, sitting in front of our old house. My parents still live there. The house doesn't look like that anymore, but that's where I grew up. On the bottom right is me in the middle, my big sister on the right, and my little sister on the left. Played my little sister for the under 13 badminton championship, and I won, and she was the runners-up. And on the top right is a picture of this cupboard where we used to keep all the trophies that we won. And it's just actually a few of the ones that we'd had at the time. My big sister had won so many that she used to just give them away. And so there's this love for sports and working hard, and then appreciating what you have and trying to make the best out of it. And I think this is what has basically made me, in many ways, who I am. But what is interesting is that problem solving that I was telling you. My dad spends a lot of time with my sons. Who are now also fluent in my native language, Luganda. And this fits to my education. I did my primary school in Uganda. There's a movie called Queen of Katwe. It was filmed, some of the scenes were filmed in Katwe, where I went to primary school. I did my undergrad at Makerere University. Initially, since I'd played badminton all my life, I'd hoped that I would become a sports scientist or, professional athlete. But then when I applied to the university, I didn't get the scholarship that would have enabled me to, go to university for this program. And I found out from a lady who played badminton, actually, that I could apply for these other programs that are not typically advertised. And one of those programs is environmental science. And I got into environmental science. And at the end of my 3-year program, I got the opportunity to go and do field work in the Mount Elgon region. The reason why I chose this particular subject or topic is because of my GIS and remote sensing class, which was a 3-credit class, which lasted just 1 semester. But it was so interesting to me. I was so interested in working with computers, from the little exposure that I had in high school. And I really, really pursued the idea of going to go do field work. It was my first time to leave my parents' house. I went into the mountains. I worked with mountain ranges. And this, opened up the idea that there's a lot more out there that I could study. And while I was applying for a master's, I wanted to do it abroad. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do it abroad is because my sister was in New York at the time, and she encouraged me to apply to the US. And I looked for programs in environmental science. So I got into the Geography and Environment Engineering program at the Johns Hopkins University. This is me at my graduation with Dr. Ed Bauer, who was the chair of the department, who really helped me at a time when it was so hard for me to meet, to financially meet the requirement for the program, but then also encouraged me to do these other classes that were, basically have become essential for the work that I'm doing right now. And then the picture on the right, fast forward into my PhD, I applied to do a PhD where I could combine all the skills and knowledge that I've gained over, the years and what I would gain during my PhD, and apply them to a problem back home. And my PhD at the University of Maryland College Park enabled me to do exactly that. And this is me with my mom and the chair of our department, Dr. Chris Justice, and he was my PhD advisor as well, and encouraged me to explore and learn. So I did a lot of field work over the years, and this helped me to think on my own and find questions that I could answer with remote sensing and GIS. So doing my PhD, so this is one of my favorite things about doing GIS and remote sensing, just being in the field, meeting the people, having so much fun, walking in muddy water, climbing hills, jumping over holes, and collecting information about Earth, and, being present where people are actually struggling with the types of problems that we want to, our information or our work or our research to really help. This is my favorite part about my research and work. And the other favorite part is trainings. I've been doing a lot of trainings across East and Southern Africa. I've worked in in Uganda, in Kenya, in Rwanda. More recently, we started doing work in Mali, and this has been a great opportunity to work with so many different people from so many different cultures, and has shaped my thinking and it helps me what to do more and work, with more people, because the more I get involved in other communities or other countries there, I find solutions to problems that I'd had before that then I can apply back in other places. Some of the things that I've done over the last couple of years has been advancing crop monitoring, like Stacy mentioned in the introduction, and I've been able to work with Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Mali in implementing their crop monitor systems, working with analysts and ministries of agriculture, and formed a really great network of what I call our crop monitor champions in the different countries. My work doesn't, initially, I thought that using remote sensing might not be able to, directly influence and affect people, a farmer or an individual in a village somewhere. But while I was right about doing field work for my PhD, I got this opportunity. I'd gone to do field work. I'd gone with my big camera. I'd taken a lot of pictures, recorded videos. I'd ground data, and then I used to write this summer report about my field work. And when I did it this time, I went and introduced it to the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda. And when I did, they said, wow, we've been looking for this information, for evidence to show that there's a very big problem, and this is a very good way to show these data. And I was invited to this interministerial committee literally the next day from when I got back from my field work. And behold, a decision was made that there is no doubt that there's a big problem in the country. And the Saturday after the Thursday of the meeting, the country had already, allocated resources to go and provide food aid to the Karamoja region. This encouraged me that there is a way that we can actually help the farmer with remote sensing and GIS. So what I think for me, remote sensing and GIS it provides so much insight, but it supports answering so many questions and providing information about what's going on. And in the last couple of years, I've been able to use remote sensing and GIS for looking at mapping refugee settlements, building on data that we collected with drones. More recently, trying to understand locust damage using satellite data. I've been involved in work on mapping landslides and how they've affected communities in the northeastern part of Uganda. I was involved with the World Bank Climate Investment Fund and helped develop so many country climate profiles that are currently online and provide just a clear overview, a basic overview of what climate change means for this country's main economy, main sectors for development. I've been lucky enough in this year, I've been on the BBC sharing on science in action. 2 days ago, a podcast on locusts was also published on the Discovery, and that was also featured an interview for me, which was really fantastic. And my sons too, being shared. I mean, it was such a great. It's been such a great time for me to share and encourage other people to come into our field and do more. Of course, it wouldn't be possible without an amazing, supportive, not only in my family, my parents, my sisters, everybody is really encouraging. My parents can watch my sons for many weeks when I'm gone, and this has helped me really be able to continue doing the work that I'm doing with trainings. My husband taking care of our sons. But I have this great team of women in the NASA Harvest program. On the right, Alyssa, in the middle, Mbal Becker-Chef is the director of NASA Harvest. They also have kids, and they understand how hard it is, and it's been encouraging to keep going, because I have these women who I look up to and who are also encouraging me. And I'll just stop here. I think my 10 minutes were up a while ago with this quote again. And before I didn't really have big dreams, but I think right now my dreams scare me because I want my work to be more relevant to more people, but then also really clearly contribute to the individuals whose lives are at stake, at risk because of climate change, climate variability, and all these other environmental factors that if they're not monitored, there will be a big challenge for their livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was amazing, and I know you have a lot going on, so I really appreciate you joining us this morning. That's fantastic. So our next presenter is Dr. Susan Wolfinbarger. Dr. Susan Wolfinbarger's work focuses on the conceptualization, development, and deployment of geospatial technologies and information for a variety of human rights and conflict-related issues. The former director of the AAAS Geospatial Technologies Project, Susan is now the analytics team lead in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State and received her PhD from The Ohio State University. So Susan, if you're ready, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. As Stacy said, I'm Susan Wolfinbarger. I'm really pleased to be with you today and honored to have been included in the Women in GIS book. And given that Esri has put this event on, I decided to build my presentation today in the new Story Maps template. I want to tell you a little bit about my background before I jump into the majority of my comments, which are going to be about my work studying conflict and human rights at both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and at the U.S. Department of State. I grew up in Irvine, Kentucky, a small town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. As a first-generation college student, I went to undergraduate at Eastern Kentucky University, just down the street in Richmond, Kentucky. And that's really when I discovered geography as a discipline. I took a Geography 101 class and I was mesmerized by the photos and stories that I heard from around the world. And this encouraged me to do my first study abroad that you see a picture of. It was a month in Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands. And a fun fact is that was the first time I ever got on an airplane. That experience made me fall in love with the Galapagos Islands. And so when I went to the George Washington University in DC for my master's degree, I made that the topic of my studies. This was also when I discovered GIS. I was able to spend a number of weeks in the Galapagos where I was seeking to understand perceptions of environmental degradation related to the tourism industry. Between my master's and PhD work, I fell into human rights. And I say fell because I was searching for a paid internship so that I could stay in DC for the summer. And it turns out that AAAS was hiring for the first ever intern for the new Geospatial Technologies and Human Rights project. That summer, I dove headfirst into human rights and remote sensing for the first time. AAAS was doing groundbreaking work in this new idea that remote sensing could be used to document certain types of human rights violations. My first project was working to document systematic housing demolitions undertaken by the government of Zimbabwe during Operation Murambatsvina, such as the complete destruction of the village of Porta Farm that you see on your screen. Each of those red dots represents a structure that was destroyed. There were 870 in that location alone. So that inspired me to move my research away from environment and ecotourism into human rights documentation and litigation. I think much to the chagrin of my committee at the Ohio State University, because I suddenly didn't really fit in with the program that I was just beginning. But we made it work, and as soon as I finished my comprehensive exams to get to ABD SAS, I actually left and went back to DC to start a permanent position at AAAS. So I definitely recommend taking advantage of opportunities as they arise. But as you see from the photo, in 2012, I did eventually finish my dissertation and graduated. So at AAAS, as I was hinting at before, we really work to identify ways to document human rights violations using geospatial technologies. And later we expanded out to cover a broader range of conflict topics. We worked with groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to develop their capabilities for using geospatial technologies to augment their qualitative research methods. We use things like optical, thermal, and radar imaging, as well as GPS cameras and UAVs to further explore these different methods of documenting human rights violations. My first day at AAAS was August 1st, 2008. And you may remember that the conflict between Georgia and Russia broke out on the evening of August 7th of that year. So diving in the deep end during my first week on the job, we were able to obtain high-resolution satellite images for key dates for when the area around Shingvali in South Ossetia passed from Georgian control to Russian control. And we found that while there was some shelling early on that you can see in these orange dots, the majority of damage to the area occurred after Russia took control, which are the red dots, and a lot of the damage that happened in that time period was in ethnic areas outside of the city, and these were actually burned rather than shelled, so very different types of damage. That report eventually led to me testifying at the European Court of Human Rights, and kind of took AAAS in a new direction where we started submitting expert reports to places like the International Criminal Court, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to be able to give them additional evidence in cases. So as I mentioned earlier, part of my work at AAAS started moving to conflict more broadly. And I had the pleasure of working with the Smithsonian Institution and the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Museum on an NSF-funded project that documented the destruction of cultural heritage during times of conflict. And the image that you see on the screen is from an exhibit that we co-created. We focused on the conflicts in Syria and Iraq and documented many aspects of threat to cultural heritage in these conflict zones. For example, the intentional destruction of religious sites that you see here on the screen. This is in Mosul, Iraq, and this is Nebe Yunus, the tomb of the prophet Jonah. So the tomb is visible here, and just about a week and a half later, we saw with satellite imagery that it had been completely destroyed. And it's obscured a little by my screen here, but we also saw heavy vehicles like dump trucks at the site. And then finally, only about a month later, the site was completely cleared of all evidence that holy site existed. We were also able to document things like looting at sensitive sites like Dura Europos, where we saw that there were so many looting pits in the main part of the site that we couldn't actually tell one from the other. And we also saw a lot of things like military emplacements at archaeological sites, like we saw those in Palmyra. In 2016, I caught the State Department's eye and was asked to come and think about how we could use more geospatial analytics and incorporate that into the work of the State Department. So I am in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and our mission is to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict that undermines U.S. national security interests. And we do this across 3 lines of effort, which are strategic prevention, conflict resolution, and security sector stabilization. I'm based in the new Office of Advanced Analytics, where we have a team with a wide range of backgrounds, from geography to political science to engineering and mathematics. And I will say that a huge portion of our office is made up of women, which is exciting. And we work to bring data-driven analysis into the hands of policymakers. Some of the recent projects we've conducted have used emerging hotspot analysis, optical remote sensing, and spatial regression. And although I can't share those specific analysis projects with you today because of sensitivity, I do want to talk about some of our other work to advance the use of geospatial tools and technologies. One of the ways that we want to ensure that better information is being shared is the creation of reliable data on conflict. In 2017, we began funding the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, to expand from its coverage in Africa. And with some partnerships from some international funding partners, ACLED is now nearly global in coverage. And they release geocoded data on events of political violence and political unrest on a weekly basis. So this operations dashboard that I quickly put together was using a feed of the most recent week of data that's actually published on ArcGIS Online. And as you can see, there's information about the event, some narrative, the types of events, we have fatalities, and there's just a huge, rich amount of data that's hiding kind of in this data that's coming out from ACLID. And since we are doing this event partially online because of everyone staying at home because of COVID-19, I really wanted to highlight that a resource that might be of use to folks is that ACLID is making a coding of their data that is covering events that are just related to COVID-19, and you can download that every week directly from their website at acliddata.com, and that's freely available. We're also working to make our data and analytic products available across the State Department with our Instability Monitoring and Analysis Platform, or IMAP. IMAP helps us get timely assessments based on the best sources available into the hands of decision makers. To create this interactive resource, 2 years ago, we stood up the first ArcGIS enterprise for the State Department. We're able to share products like story maps and operations dashboards to our colleagues around the world with this. We also use analytics and geospatial technologies to support public diplomacy efforts. To date, we've released 2 public story maps, one that I'm showing you now on the conflict in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia. This site, within the first 24 hours of it being released, we had about 40,000 hits on the site. And to date, we have had about 250,000 views. And the purpose of this site was really to show the impact on civilians that are living in this war zone in eastern Ukraine. So we have sections in here, for example, that shows the town of Jovanka, and we have photos that were taken from on the ground and in these different locations. And we wanted to pair that with an overview so people could get a sense of the scale of what was happening. So you can see part of the town here. These are all buildings. This is roads. And then when you look to the middle of the conflict, you can see there are trenches throughout the town. These are craters, and all the structures have been destroyed. So we really wanted people to understand what is happening on the ground there, partially so that our European colleagues would help us maintain sanctions, which are a great way to discourage further Russian aggression. And last, I just wanted to share this quote by Jack Dangermond that I think gets at what we're all about in my office at the State Department, which is knowing where things are and why is essential to rational decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. It was really cool to see story maps used in your presentation. So that's amazing. I had one little housekeeping note. If some people are not able to figure out how to submit questions, so if you're in a browser, you'll see on the side of your screen a small circle that has a question mark in it, and that's how you, if you press that, that's how you could be able to submit questions. So if you're having any trouble finding that, look to the side of your screen and hopefully it'll be there. So our next presenter is Veronica Velez. Veronica is an associate professor and founding director of the Education and Social Justice minor at Western Washington University. Her research is grounded in critical race theory, Latinx critical theory, and radical cartography. She's influenced and inspired by these varied but interrelated frameworks, and she pioneered the critical race spatial analysis in an approach that seeks to deepen spatial consciousness and expand the use of GIS in critical race research in education. She's the proud daughter of a Mexican immigrant mother and a Panamanian immigrant father, whose journey to provide her with a quality education fundamentally inspires her work for social justice. So, Veronica, if you're all set, we'll hand it over to you.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Double check. So good morning, everyone. Truly, it's such an honor to share this space with these incredible women that form part of the book, and also the incredible team that that put this book together. It, you know, in some ways, as I was sharing with some of the editors, in our field in education, GIS is still in some ways very relatively new, though I think it's been used quite you know, quite expansively in the classroom and for teaching, but in the context of research, less so. It is expanding, and we're also thinking through like how we can bring in a more center of spatial consciousness in our work. And so, you know, to hear these presentations, I'm sort of blown away because I'm like, wow, there's just so much to do and expand, and just so inspired by everyone. So thank you all for this opportunity to share a little bit about my work with you this morning. So to kind of get started, one of the things I thought might be helpful to start, kind of similar to my previous two colleagues and presenters, is to share a little bit about how I came to the work. So one of the things, for me, one of the key things that brought me to GIS was I was a grassroots organizer working primarily with migrant mothers, actually in my hometown of Pasadena, California. I did that for about 15 years, working on different aspects of educational reform and thinking through, you know, how migrant voices can have more of a say at the decision-making table for policy reform for their children. And this stems, quite frankly, from my own experience growing up as a child of immigrant parents, watching my own mother sort of rebuffed by the school system, oftentimes struggling, not knowing the language, not knowing the system, how to maneuver and provide quality education for both my sister and I. And so many years later, you know, it felt, so much of it was inspired by my personal struggles through this, but finding myself working with women that very much reminded me of my own mother, and thinking through how to support, what is my role in some of this. And so in that work, I came across, I was in graduate school at the same time, and had a beautiful mentor who I'll speak about next, who said, you know, I really would love one of my students to take a GIS course. And just to give a little bit of my background, which I know we'll speak to a little bit later, my undergrad background, I attempted to do engineering as an undergrad and failed pretty miserably at it. And for many, many years blamed myself that I was just simply not good at math or not good at this work. Come to find out, you know, how much gender played a part into that, and oftentimes speaking about how I was the only woman in most of my classes, and most of it, and you know, in this study. And so I think part of what for me was so important is restoring my own faith in my ability to engage in sort of, you know, mathematical and statistical modeling in this work. Took some time, but you know, one of the challenges for me is to think about how can I support young women who are thinking about this work and engaging in attempting to center GIS in their professional or in their professional lives. So, but going back to this, I think for me the organizing work was really key. I was taking, so my mentors, you know, encouraged me to take a GIS class. I jumped right in, and I fell in love with the work, but I wanted it to be useful to my organizing work. And so these mothers, as I'll share a little bit, I'm going to actually go more specific into the project that we did together, because one of the things that for me in my recent work with GIS is to really think through the methodology of how do we develop, how do we engage in digital map making that's attuned to questions of representation and power that are inherent in maps. And so, but wanted to honor these women because these were who really inspired me to think through what does it mean to ground truth maps or to ground truth space from the lived experiences of those that are most marginalized by society. And to kind of give some context, again, I mentioned my mentor. This is Dr. Danny Solórzano at UCLA, who was also really big in encouraging me to continue my development of GIS and to continue to develop geospatial tools for the work we do in educational research. And it was so important because he encourages me, but also encourages so many of his students to really delve deep into interdisciplinary work and to think about how tools from other fields and other practices can really help us in the work we do in education. And so we, through our collaboration and again, building from the work of the mothers, built out this framework called critical race spatial analysis. And some good friends of ours edited and curated this book that has several pieces in there that speak to some of the work that's currently being done in education to think about spatial tools and spatial analysis in the work of education specifically. And our piece that kind of opens the books opens the book, talks specifically about how we can conceptualize GIS as a tool for critical race research, and more specifically, how can we engage GIS to not only talk about racial disparity, but also to engage in sort of anti-racist landscape and anti-racist work. So what can that look like in our field? And that was really important to us. To kind of give some sense in terms of the initial questions that drove some of the work, and again, I want to kind of delve deep just for a second here into this particular case of the work we did with the mothers. But some of the initial questions, how can educational researchers benefit from a geographic spatial analysis? And more specifically, how can it be used as a methodological or conceptual tool for looking at the role of race and racism and its connection to schools and educational opportunity? And then, of course, being in education, we're also thinking quite deeply about how can we use GIS to teach about injustice, and particularly teach about injustice as it pertains to schools and education. So these were sort of the broad questions that really kind of framed our entry into GIS and thinking about how do we engage it, how do we utilize it for the work we do. Now, I'm going to show you a few maps again from the work of the months. I think they really speak to this kind of iterative ground truthing process that I'll share a little bit about. But this is if anybody's from LA, you'll probably be familiar. This is Pasadena, my hometown, Southern California. This is our school district. And oftentimes we talk about this notion as I share about GIS and spatial work and education, talk about the notion of a spatial imagination and the way that our imaginations are shaped by who we think lives in Pasadena or in any area for that matter. And so what folks don't know is that in my hometown, there's a large community of Latino immigrants that shape a lot of the local political, economic sort of context within my district, which you'll see here sort of in the sort of darker shades in this region. And so this neighborhood is known as the Northwest neighborhood of Pasadena. And as I shared these maps with the mothers, one of the things that was really powerful is that they began to think about, how can the maps help us tell the story of our work, of sort of a racial history within our district that people don't really see because their spatial imagination doesn't go to imagine that there are people of color in our district. And so I got really fancy with some of my initial tools, trying to create things like a hotspot analysis, really identifying that this in the same Northwest region is also sort of an area where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of concern, particularly around some of those neighborhoods, and policy around in our area was really focused on how do we improve the conditions in the Northwest. But the mothers were really powerful in sort of pushing back on some of these maps and being concerned that while this may show sort of a correlation between poverty and also the Latino neighborhood in our area, we can also really quickly delve into these topographies of pathology, because the maps don't tell us causality. They simply tell us the relational aspects between where things are located and understanding, how they relate to the communities and neighborhoods in those areas. Now, I know with some of the new tools in GIS, we can do a lot more around spatial regressions and other things, but at the time we were really thinking, the maps don't tell a story by themselves. And I think we need to think about how these can also reify particular deficit notions of our communities that we're also trying to uplift through this work. The other thing that was also really important for us in our work was really understanding how the Northwest and the educational opportunities in the Northwest were different from educational opportunities across the district. But one of the things that was really telling is that the majority of the students in this neighborhood were actually attending school across the entire district. And again, the mothers knew this because their grassroots organizing work for over 20 years spoke to sort of this racial divide, not in the way that we typically understand racial divides in communities, but as sort of post Brown versus Board of Education, and the way that communities were being restructured so that districts were not, necessarily separated, by Black or white schools or Latinx or white schools, but that actually entire districts were being reorganized, which I'll share next, across private and public educational systems. So in our hometown, you can see there on the left are sort of just a distribution of private schools in our region, and on the right are the distribution of public schools, with the 4 schools circled in red being noted as schools that were going to be shut down as a result of not having enough bodies, not having enough students to fill those classrooms. What is telling about our district that in the same region that you have 25 public schools, you have 82 private schools. Now the mothers again knew this, and they understood these dynamics really well. They said, this is nothing new to us, but seeing them visually portrayed in a map provided them with sort of a geopolitical literacy that they could use in their campaigns around justice locally. And that again was part of a lot of this work, is thinking like how do the maps help tell a story, combined with the mother's wisdom to think through the role of GIS in their organizing work. I'll skip this one, but one of the things that again, just really quick here, is that the distribution across both the private and public sector in our district were very different. So that 93% of students at private schools were white, versus 14% of students in the public schools were considered to be white. But again, the mothers in this back and forth, this iterative process in developing this map said, we want you to map the founding dates. And sure enough, the founding dates of the private schools in our region, 69, were founded basically during the time period when mandated busing was put into effect, not just here, but across the country. So we understand these as pretty much as white flight. And so again, the telling of the story, this what we call a sort of a counter-cartographic narrative, was really important to us, because I think it began to show a little bit about how the mother's wisdom really kind of shaped each point, each iteration of the map. And I know I'm running out of time here, but I wanted to just kind of speak a little bit to this notion of ground truthing that I think is helping us conceptualize and help as sort of the next phase of my work, is I develop and bring in my critical race theory, my Latino critical theory background, and also some work I do around Chicana feminisms, to think about how do we shape GIS to help tell the stories and to help build spatial models from the lived experiences of our communities. And so this notion of ground truthing is built into the framework of critical race spatial analysis that I briefly alluded to earlier. It draws directly from GIS technician frameworks that says, as we think about ground truthing as a process by which we send technicians out to verify satellite imagery, what would it mean to send community members out, such as the mothers, to help verify neighborhood boundaries, color lines, the use of spaces and the perceptions of those spaces, and how can cartographers engage in this sort of spatial wisdom and in collaboration with communities to determine whether a map accurately reflects the lived realities of the folks that live there. And so I share this because I think that as we think through, as folks are beginning to think about how they might employ GIS critically to do anti-racist work, or to engage in understanding kind of women's worlds, spatial worlds, and geographic realities, how do we employ methodological frameworks that help us get at the ways in which maps also not just reflect reality, but can also create reality, and thinking deeply and attentively to those kind of reflexive components that I think are really important to GIS. So I'll end there, and I look forward to engaging with some questions at the end, but thank you again for the opportunity to share just briefly a little bit about my work.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was really, really fascinating. And don't forget, if you want to ask questions after the women speak, if you're in a browser, there's a little question mark at the side of your screen, and some people will see it down at the bottom. So again, thank you very much. And our next presenter is Rhiannan Price. Rhiannan Price leads the Sustainable Development Practice at Maxar Technologies, and she works with public and private sector partners across the development and humanitarian spectrum. She focuses on accelerating use of our space-based technology in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She also serves on the Applied Science Advisory Committee for NASA, the Chicago Council's Global Task Force on Food Security, and the Technology Advisory Board for the Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. Prior to joining Maxar, she worked at a small tech firm specializing in international agriculture and served in the Peace Corps. She's lived in Uganda, Tanzania, and Dominica, and speaks 4 languages. She has a master's in international human rights from the Korbel School at the University of Denver, where she was a Bourne Fellow. And her talk is going to focus on the value of high-resolution satellite imagery for sustainable development and humanitarian assistance. She's going to highlight a couple of case studies with Maxar's partners and working in global health, climate action, energy access, disaster response, and urban planning. So Rhiannan, let's turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stacy, and thanks everybody for joining. As you could tell from my intro, I'm definitely an expert of nothing. But with that, I think it's a good kind of segue into where I focus for Maxar, which is essentially figuring out how we can apply our technology to all of the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations. So this is the idea that, you know, all our technology in particular can be helpful across all of the goals, whether directly or indirectly. And much of my job and my passion really is unlocking the value of technology, especially for these types of social good applications, whether that's sustainable development or humanitarian assistance, much of what, of course, is encompassed in the SDGs. So today I wanted to walk through just a few of the partnerships that we have and projects that we've enabled, and what that kind of impact has been and why those are so important to me. The first one I want to talk about is maybe one of the more obvious applications of where satellite imagery has helped. So this is an example from projects that we've done over a number of years in Indonesia with a few different partners. We're actually essentially, you know, monitoring and surveilling forest area to in real time kind of understand change and understand things like forest fires and what's actually happening with our natural resources. And as you know, this is mission critical because Indonesia is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases behind those of us in the US and elsewhere. And so what we've done is partnering with other companies. This is an example where we're working with MDA out of Canada and their RadarSat-2 constellation, which is going to bring some of the what we call radar data and kind of tell us different things about the planet and what we see versus kind of the constellation that Maxar works with, which is more optical imagery. And so what we're doing is monitoring for Asia Pulp and Paper, a customer of ours that really wants to monitor their forest concessions and also a kind of evidence that they're making improvements in terms of protecting natural resources, especially because they're near protected areas in national forests in Indonesia. So this system is actually monitoring about 3.8 million hectares every 24 days. And the cool thing is about radar imagery is it actually penetrates through clouds. So you can detect these pretty small changes in forest area and forest cover and be able to actually understand what's happening in kind of near real time, so to speak. And so what that actually looks like is this. So you can see here, you know, these are some of the sample alerts and what you're seeing here with the kind of green represents the boundary of the national park. The blue represents the concession that Asia Pulp and Paper is monitoring for their suppliers, and the red are these changes. So these are the detections where folks, based on the radar imagery, something has changed there. So this hasn't told us what's changed necessarily, but we know change is happening. And because we have multiple data sources, we can actually then use other satellites from the Maxar constellation to get what we would call kind of optical imagery over these areas to actually understand what's happening on the ground. So this is just one of those kind of change alerts where we have optical imagery and can actually understand and confirm that yes, there has been forest cover loss here. We can validate when it's happened, how much of the area, and exactly kind of when we confirmed it as well. And that's important because for suppliers like APP and a lot of these companies, they have kind of net zero commitments that they're adhering to, right? And made these kind of pledges, particularly around kind of climate change and kind of improving their supply chains. And so as part of this, APP has adopted a really innovative way using GIS and space-based technology to be able to monitor forest areas across a pretty large area. And they've been able to evidence outcomes because they're taking this data-driven approach. And so together, we've actually been able to show that their forest concession tree cover loss, the natural forest cover loss, I should say, dropped from about 5 to 6% change year over year to just less than about 0.5% change in the conservation area. So again, they could kind of evidence and also partner with government to show that this is working and that they're making progress towards their stated goals as well. Now, of course, that makes a huge difference when you can actually understand the drivers of change, because not just for APP, but for governments around the world, this is also mission critical to one, informing policy, but also enforcing policy, right? So these are just a few examples of using that kind of system of complementary data of how we can understand when is it a logging activity that's contributing versus illegal land conservation versus legal expansion and things like that. So we can really understand not only what's changing, but why is it changing too. And this is going to speak to, I think, more of the things that we see in the future, and some of what you'll see is kind of my call to action for everybody at the end of this, which is, what more can we do, especially when it comes to, for instance, mapping carbon stocks from space, or helping in terms of actually mitigating and adapting and taking some of these interventions when it comes to climate. And a lot of this is how space-based technology can help, and how satellite imagery in particular can help us cover large areas and fill those information gaps. Changing gears really quickly to just a different use case that I think, to some of the other, my kind of fellow presenters, and where they focus much more on kind of the human dimension, right? And I think that's where, a lot of our work, and perhaps the less obvious work, where we've, had really a lot of success, especially with partners like International Justice Mission. And one example is fighting human trafficking, and not only actually, attempting to rescue survivors, but actually disrupting human trafficking networks. And that's what IJM dedicates their work to. And so we're privileged to just be a part, a technology partner to them, supplying what is really critical information. And so this is an example from one of their investigations a few years ago, where they're actually taking not only satellite imagery, but also other third-party data like social media feeds and photos, and kind of interpolating those data to understand where are likely trafficking activities happening. And so they can follow persons of interest based on their online and open source information, then use satellite imagery to actually put a spatial dimension to that, and work with local law enforcement to then intervene where they have a kind of evidence case. And so the satellite imagery, of course, is really helpful to actually understand and make the case to local counterparts to act on these things, and also to feel like they can validate a lot of the analyses that they're seeing. So what you're seeing here is some of how they've triangulated using photos from Facebook, Google Street View, satellite imagery, to actually understand where, in this case, for this particular investigation in the Philippines, where this cyber sex trafficking was happening, and to be able to actually very specifically target the response. And this has been a successful method for them, and an important tool in their toolkit as they fight this type of injustice, and obviously can use these as tools kind of around the world. And what this has meant is, in this particular investigation, that they were able to actually rescue a number of human trafficking victims, as well as apprehend a number of suspects. So again, very direct impact, and something, of course, that we're proud to play a small role in terms of our partnership with IJM. And last but not least, as I kind of wrap up here, I wanted to call a really timely example with my kind of call to action for everybody of how do you want to use technology for your own communities, and given kind of the crisis with the pandemic that we're all in. And so part of our work is also supporting global health programs and public health work. And the way that we do that, especially in places in developing countries and places in the kind of global south, is actually extracting building footprints against satellite imagery, and doing that at scale using things like artificial intelligence. And the reason that's so important is because we're able to then do subsequent analyses like what you're seeing here, which is actually identifying what those building footprints represent. So in this case, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, those buildings represent health clinics. So we can start to actually map out where are all the health clinics across a given country, and then with other third-party data start to understand, do we have enough vaccines to distribute to all of the populations that are nearby, because we can also now have proxy indicators for population density off of things like satellite imagery. So this is just an example of working with partners called Grid3, that are geospatial modelers and folks that are working very closely with in-country partners, government and otherwise, to really make sure that these data are being used in kind of immediate and providing immediate value. And so this is just one example of what we have been doing, I think, over the last couple of years in terms of strengthening health surveillance systems. But now what that means for us is, of course, pivoting to support the pandemic response. And much of what we were already doing in these capabilities can be translated to support the COVID-19 response in a lot of countries, depending on what stage they're at. And so with that, I wanted to just kind of point out that Maxar also has an open data program where we've been releasing open imagery to support the COVID-19 response. Most recent is our most recent kind of event that we're supporting. So please check it out, grab that data, think about what you can do for your community with kind of open, non-commercial, high-res satellite imagery, and please do submit requests too if there are other areas where we can support those types of things. So in wrapping, I guess, in terms of kind of my own personal journey, this is really what it's about, and where the rubber meets the road is, taking technology and they're only so good as the humans behind it and how we apply it and making sure that it's, providing something meaningful for the humans behind all this. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rhiannan. That was really great. That was really informative. So thank you all four of you so much for your great presentations. Right now we're going to take questions. We're going to open it up. I see that a lot of questions have been coming in. And so the first question that we wanted to ask for all four of our presenters, and feel free to answer, is that what advice would you give women who want to start a career in GIS or one of the STEM fields? Who'd like to take that first?
I can.
This is Susan.
Yes, this is Susan. I think there's kind of two things. One is kind of when you're getting started in this field, really try to find the resources that are out there for you. There's a lot of things available. For example, when I was doing my undergraduate research, I was part of the NOVA program. It's a program for first-generation college students, and they helped me after I identified that I wanted to go on and do graduate work. They helped me apply for master's programs. They helped me pay to go visit and do interviews at different universities. So I think it's really important to take advantage of the resources that are out there. And then just in general, don't be afraid to try out new ideas and kind of blaze your own trail. I mean, most of the work that I did, at AAAS and that I've been doing at the State Department has been coming up with kind of new ideas and then selling people on them. And so I think, if you have a good idea and something interesting, don't give up on it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Would anybody else like to take that question?
Stacy, Catherine here.
Hi, Catherine.
I was going to say, for me, exploring and learning about other places and, really getting to live outside of your comfort zone is what you can do with geography and GIS. And I think this changes who you are, because exploring other environments or other places, I think, really does strengthen who you are as a person and helps you reflect on who you are and what your place is in the world when you get to see, what is really out there, be it, from your desk looking at remote sensing and trying to make sense of these images and what they mean, and trying to find answers by looking at maps. One of the maps that Rhiannan showed about, this health centers in the Congo, I tried to do something like that when I was looking at the refugee settlements. And for me, the question that I was looking for was, how easy or how quickly can a person access a healthcare center? Do they have to walk so far, since most of them don't have vehicles and cars? And just looking at the data helps you think about other ways that you can communicate what a community is going through or is doing or is trying to achieve. And I really find I've found the talks really, really inspirational today because of that.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I totally agree. Anybody else have anything to add?
I can jump in really quick. This is Veronica Velez.
Hi.
I shared a little bit. I think that I had a really rough go in my undergrad years with exploring engineering. I stuck with it for a bit until I finally moved on, but it came back in a different way through GIS. And I think my love of math and science never went away. And I'm grateful to have had a loving community and especially a really a loving mentor who helped me sort of to restore, like I mentioned, my faith in my abilities to engage in math and science and to bring that into a field. Even though my formal training was more ethnographic and qualitative, to really think about this kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to our work. So I think that what I would offer as advice to folks pursuing this is that you can explore these questions through GIS or the sort of a geographic analysis through multiple disciplinary lenses. And I think there's a necessity, and I would say to center what a spatial or geographic consciousness in the work across different fields. And so you can be asking a question, say in education or in women's studies, for example, that has, I think, very important implications for geography. And so I think that for folks that are interested, there isn't just a limitation to just geography or urban planning to pursue these questions. Like you really should see this as a much more expansive approach to exploring different kinds of questions from many different sort of vantage points in different fields. So as someone who came back to it in a very interesting way, I have found such utility in it, and it's helped me to really think and broaden my frameworks in education in ways that I could have never imagined without this tool. So so that's my advice that I would offer.
I'll add, this is Rhiannan, I'll add really quickly onto that to kind of build off what some of the other panelists have said, to say, definitely be your own best advocate as well. I think that's been a lesson for me kind of time and time again, where I think especially, you can do the best work and you can have all the right credentials and the qualifications to be in a conversation or to be, offering an opinion. But I think ultimately you're going to be your best champion, right? And so I think that's just something that I kind of remind myself, especially, I'm in a very male-dominated industry and a male-dominated company. And that's what keeps me sane sometimes too. So just a reminder for anybody out there too.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's really important. Thank you. So we have a question here from Dawn Wright, who works at Esri. Hi, Dawn. This is for Veronica. Dawn says, I'm often asked what areas of science need more participation by the GIS community, and I often say social justice research. So it's awesome to learn more about your work. Where are some of the most effective avenues for getting the word out about what you're doing, either to the GIS community or to the academic community?
So in many ways, I like to say that I'm sort of an accidental academic. I would say like I got here by accident. This really wasn't supposed to happen. But I say that with a lot of love because I don't, I think and I'll speak for myself, like these journeys can't happen without a community or sort of a collective group of folks, mentors, family, etc. And I think for me, the reason for me that I found and pursued GIS so fervently and in my field, which it hadn't up until recently begun to make, I think, an entry point, was that that I saw its potential for organizing work, for really shifting the political landscape. So I remember which I didn't share and talk about, that part of these maps, and there was a whole series of maps that I worked with the mothers and different types of projects that I worked with them on. And then they took the maps and presented in front of city councils, in front of school boards, and shared their story. Now, one of the things that's really powerful about what happened was that the mothers had been actually sharing these stories for many, many years. And it wasn't until GIS and the maps that I think some civic leaders began to pay attention. Now, there's some complexities in that. I would argue that the mother stories on their own should have held enough validity, but they understood in that moment the power of GIS to visualize their story, to help understand these patterns that weren't just anecdotal, not just another mother coming into a school board meeting to complain about their child. It was that there were patterns here, and that GIS helped to tell their stories. And so for me, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is how can we leverage this tool, particularly with the grassroots organizations, particularly folks on the ground. If we're going to think critically about our methodologies for how we create maps and how we partner with communities, we need to build from the ground up. And so I think part of is really thinking through, because what are some nonprofit or grassroots networks that could maybe, because of resources, because of access, haven't explored GIS in its full capacity, but given the opportunity could see how much of a political literacy tool it could be for them to really engage their campaigns. I know it was for these mothers, and it's been for several other projects that I've worked on since. So I think part of the question is, and I think, I just noticed across all 4 of our presentations, all of us are connected to some kind of humanitarian, justice-related projects. I mean, and it's unsurprising to me that these are all women leading this work. So I think the more we can think about, who gets to kind of be, more of these webinars, these conversations to showcase this work, to talk about the ways that we're building, spatially building models from to engage in questions of justice, and to think about who's going to be most impacted and connect with them in thinking creatively and innovatively about our tools. I think that's really the answer. But yeah, that's what I would say, the initial piece of this. But I would, there's so much more that we can go into, but that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I have a question for Susan. How do you know the data is accurate or viable that you pull from various places?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's something that, I've thought a lot about in my work in conflict zones and human rights, where a lot of time we are just struggling to find information because these locations are so dangerous and inaccessible. I think for different sources, there's different ways to go about it. For the work that I did with courts and commissions, we really relied on satellite imagery, which has really good metadata, and it's really easy to kind of document the chain of custody for it. And actually, I've been involved with some work with AAAS and the University of California's Berkeley's Human Rights Center and others to put out more guidelines about how you can, if you're producing data, say if you're collecting UAV imagery or something, how you can do that to the standards that are reliable for others to use. So that's more on kind of the imagery end of things, and then kind of on the other end of things, like I showed ACLID, and that's based on media reports, so news media, social media, and you have to understand that because of what that data is based off of, it's not a complete reflection of reality, because an event that doesn't get reported in the news isn't going to end up in the data set. So I think you have to just be aware of the context of how the data was created when you're using it in your analysis, and then properly caveat it. And then I feel in those cases that I feel comfortable using a wide variety of data sources in my analysis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is an important question, so thank you. And Catherine, we have a question for you from China Williams, who was actually another great woman in our Volume 2 book. She would like to ask you how young African girls can be engaged from GIS from a young age. Such girls that are not exposed, sorry, let me just go down a little bit, they're not exposed to the tech world constantly. How can we make them exposed to tech and further them in the STEM fields?
That's a great question, Tiana. And actually, Dawn and I participated in this African Women in GIS webinar, which I think is one of those really great opportunities for within the smaller community of women who might already be in GIS across Africa. I think one of the things we actually spoke about in this webinar was thinking about strategic ways to involve women at a much younger age. So there are lots of primary school geography teachers who are always looking for content and opportunities to support women, and these teachers could use a lot of help. And I've seen a lot of resources on Esri that can help these teachers. And I think those of us who, exposed to these resources can try and figure out a way of really engaging with primary schools. There's this great program by Esri for developing materials for schools, K through 12, and we could do the same for lower levels of education across the continent. And this is something that I'm now more actively trying to do.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially for any really young girls that want to be in STEM, but especially those who might not be exposed to tech that often. I do have a question for everyone. All of the presenters today are working in vastly different fields, but they all work in really important areas. How do you not get overwhelmed looking at all that needs to be done to improve? How do you keep working, I guess, optimistically? And I guess anyone can answer that question if they have an answer to that.
This is Rhiannan. I can start at least. I would say to, in the midst of all the things that you could focus on, think about where you in particular can make a difference. And I think that, that's a lot of considerations, right? Of, where are your talents and skills, of course, but also where are your passions, and also where's your community's need, and kind of where do you want to take your career and all of those things and engage. But I think that's kind of the thing to, it's a big world out there, but I think everybody can have an impact. I think whether it's, a localized impact or a national impact or a global impact. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind is not necessarily, and also, being okay with the understanding that you won't necessarily always know what your impact is, because a lot of times it's, I think about this from my service in the Peace Corps of, I don't necessarily know the kiddos that I taught back then and the things that we learned, and I don't necessarily know how that's translated for them later in life, but I hope it's, impacted them positively, just like, so many teachers and others out there. So that's kind of my 2 cents and what I would say to that.
Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Susan. I've worked for many years in human rights and conflict zones, and it can get pretty intense. When you're looking at images of mass graves and things like that, it can be a difficult thing. And I think you really have to keep in mind, that you have a community. You have your coworkers, you have your family and friends. A lot of universities have support services and things like that. And I think that that's something that people maybe don't think about enough. Is to reach out to, kind of like I said in my previous answer, that there's a lot of resources out there for you to find support, and you shouldn't internalize these things to yourself so much, and being able to share with others, I think, really helps. And then kind of like what Rhiannan was just saying is to, keep reminding yourself that you're making a difference to others. Like, even if it's like a small piece of analysis, one map, one before and after satellite imagery pair. I did a project looking at the destruction of an Armenian cemetery. And, it was a small project with just 2 satellite images, but it showed that the cemetery had been completely destroyed. And the human rights folks that I worked with, that just made a huge difference in their ability to advocate and to, tell the story of what had happened to them in a way that they couldn't otherwise. So you really have to, remind yourself that you are making a difference, even if it might not be immediately obvious to you. It will impact other people.
I can jump in real quick. This is Vero, and I would add that for me, my mentor one time said to me that you scratch a theory and you get somebody's biography. I never forgot that, in the sense that so much of our work, so much of my work stems from lived experience, from watching my own parents struggle to navigate foreign place, watching them deal with everyday racial assaults. Trying to navigate, my own experience going through school, that eventually led to informing a lot of my passion for this work, and to develop these tools to continue to expand our toolbox for dealing with racial injustice in schools and society more broadly. And so I think for me, I always say I'm very explicit in my own teaching as an educator to talk about the importance of love in our work, the importance of community building in our work. But I think often rage is the other side of that coin. I think rage in the sense of witnessing so much injustice, so much suffering, so much frustration is what informs also my love for my community and for the continued work that I have to continue to navigate. In that it's something that both of those things are core to, I guess, at the heart of my work. I would also say that as kind of, in building this, that for me, what's also been really helpful is that as I engage GIS, that GIS that GIS isn't just about telling the stories of racial oppression or telling the stories of color lines that divide and constrict our communities, which of course those are important, but that we're also thinking about how we can use GIS to talk about how our communities also curate space. In what ways do we also make space possible so that our lives are fully possible in those spaces? And those stories for me are as important, because we often, we want to address the inequities, and the maps help to identify what those are. But equally important is that, every day there's a lot of joy in our spaces, in our communities. Like, we live full lives despite the conditions. And so even as there is so much, harm, and we can, and GIS helps us to understand that harm in particular ways, that I want to be able to talk about the ways we make space, and how can GIS help tell those stories too. And so that also gives me some balance to my work as well, so that I'm able to study joy as much as I study, pain and suffering, I guess, if you will, in terms of understanding those kind of conditions of racial oppression. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, thank you.
Stacey,
Yeah.
I can just add real quick. I apologize.
Of course,
my son's here of having so much fun. I try to participate in the webinar.
That's okay.
In my experience, I think all the points that have been made, they're just really great points, and I just wanted to add it from my experience. When I was first doing field work in the Karamojong region, every year I would run into farmers. They've lost everything almost every single year, and it was always really frustrating. And that year, 2015, when I went, I interviewed this lady, and I recorded her video. She's standing with her family in front of a field that had completely failed, and she described it in a clear way that could convince anybody that there's a really big problem. And when I started doing this work, I didn't have this clear way of where it was going to go. But then as I went through this experience over and over, I learned, and I got to see these opportunities to actually really understand what was happening. And this was one of those very defining moments. And being able to use that video, not use it, but share with the broader community, informing this decision at the national level, I think was one of those experiences where it really showed that what I was doing wasn't completely worthless, and it wasn't just purely about looking at images and doing field work, but perhaps I'm getting to better understand what the problems are, and I'm also getting better to understand how to represent these stories. I think that's how I've sort of come to share more of these stories. So the more of these stories that I find, I try to really capture them and share them with the broader community. And I think this is really what the power of remote sensing and GIS is. Also, the other thing I was going to say about this is, I think one of the speakers said it, where you don't have to think, really big. It doesn't have to be global. It doesn't have to be about a place where everybody in the world is looking. It could just be about your small community within your neighborhood. And in my case, I was able to do work at home as in Uganda, but in an area where I'd never been before. And this is really helped me to, be brave and try to do it in other places and learn from those other places. Right? And I would encourage, others to try the same.
Thank you. That's really inspirational. Let's see, we have another question that I think is interesting as well. And so as a college student who'll be graduating next month with a GIS major, what advice do you have for job searching? I feel like this is a very competitive field, and I have a lot of anxiety about the job market right now due to the pandemic. Do you have any advice? Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of resources out there, you know, more and more job boards and things online on LinkedIn and stuff like that. But I also would say kind of think creatively about where your skills could be applied. So for example, for us at the State Department, and I will tell you, we are going to be hiring soon in my office, so keep an eye out. We're looking for some more geographers. But I think that thinking about maybe you need to read beyond the job title to see if your skills might really apply to a position. And try to learn about, and I'm talking more from the government side of things right now, there's a lot of hiring mechanisms that are out there. So all of the federal jobs get posted on USA Jobs, but there's also lots of government contracting that happens. And so there's a lot of positions that you have to kind of start learning about the ins and outs of those positions. And I actually was a contractor for a while before I became a civil servant. So I think there's a lot of places, but I haven't found a lot of good places that have everything in one place. So I'd say just cast your net widely and try to think creatively about how your skills apply to different positions.
Thanks, that's really good
I
advice.
think that's really, really good advice. The only thing I can add, I mean, it's just to complement that, is that you might not necessarily have to apply to a GIS specific job, because the skills and knowledge, the thinking in space applies to so many different sectors. We've seen maps about health, disaster, all of these things, and it could just be in an organization that might not be directly integrating GIS, or is doing it but not in a great way. And once you begin working in that organization, you can start to bring in new skills slowly, and it will be appreciated over time for sure. So I would exactly cast your net really, really wide and be open to things that don't sound like that you could do it or would do it, but then you just realize later on that you can, and that you can bring in the skills and the knowledge that you've gained over time. There are many at our University of Maryland, there's a program that focuses, there's a master's that focuses basically for people who are already professionals doing other things. And these professionals recognize that they need GIS to continue to grow and expand on what they're doing within their field. But they didn't think about it when they're, when that they would do, they would deal with maps or data. So there are definitely opportunities out there, and it might not be labeled as GIS or remote sensing, but they would be, places where you can apply those skills, even if it's not in the beginning, in a midterm or in a longer term for sure.
Great, thank you. I think that's really good advice. Let's see, this question is for all the presenters. How important has mentorship been throughout your careers?
So I can jump in on that one. I sort of, this is Vero again. I talked a little bit about it both in the book, and I shared a little bit about Dr. Danny Solorzano, who was huge for me. Having a mentor that really saw his work beyond the classroom. And I had I'm thinking more, this is in the context of higher education, and really a mentor for life. And Danny was such a big part of, continues to be a big part of my development, both of critical race spatial analysis and thinking about the work, geospatial tools and the work we do. But also, I think as also a Latinx mentor for me, understood very intimately, my journey into school and beyond and into this work, and understood how to provide both pressure when needed to continue to move me forward, but also just nurturing mentorship that allowed me to also explore, areas that traditionally don't get, brought into higher education. So I think for me, Danny was a big part of that. So I can't say enough about the importance of mentorship. And also just, the question for me, especially as we think about GIS tools in their historical sense and really understanding how they can help us tell stories across time, having intergenerational conversations or intergenerational mentorship is so important to helping us think about the importance of GIS as a historical tool as well. And so I think for me, Danny's always pushing that and helping me to understand things, intergenerationally in my work.
Anybody else have a mentor that we want to shout out to?
Well, I was going to add to that. I've been lucky and had some really fantastic mentors throughout my career, and I would say as well, I've had more formal mentors, like folks that I've definitely kind of sought out, and we kind of had more of an understanding of, you know, mentor-mentee kind of relationship, and then others that were far more informal too. And I've actually also had the privilege of learning from many of the ladies on this call as well, and just you know, being in those kind of networks. So I'd also just encourage folks to think of mentorship a little bit more broadly than maybe we have in the past too. Of, you know, definitely have those direct mentors, and I think that's great advice in terms of, you know, the intergenerational piece and all of that, and also just kind of challenging your own assumptions and challenging your own biases is always super important. But also think of the informal mentorship ways, the networking and the groups that you're part of, and things like that. Because I've had, I think, just as much value out of you know, having those communities as well. Great,
thank you. We have just a few minutes left, but we have one question I think would be really great to sort of wrap up with. If you were, this is for everyone, so please weigh in. If you were to ask everyone and anyone attending this webinar to do one action item, what would it be?
I love this, and this is Rhiannan again. I'm so glad you guys ended on this.
Yeah.
I'll reinforce mine to please go check out the open data that we have at Maxar, but also all of the other open data that's being released right now, because I think especially the GIS community has a big role to play in the ongoing pandemic response and how we recover stronger and more resilient altogether.
This is Susan. I would say that I would ask people to find ways to volunteer their skills. There's a lot of NGOs that are out there that need help with, it can be a very basic thing. They might need a map of the areas that they're working, or they might, you know, want a GIS person to help them with some more in-depth analysis. And, you know, there's programs like GIS Corps, and AAAS has a volunteer program as well for science and engineers to help with human rights projects. So I think I would just ask, especially, you know, as everybody's trying to find ways to help, you know, during this really difficult time, you know, if you can find a way to share your excellent skills that a lot of people don't have, that's a really great thing that I would love to see folks doing.
Yeah, I would add to that I think for me, what's really important that we think about how our work can constantly be in partnership with the communities that we purport to serve. You know, you know, one of the things that I learned a lot when I was working with the mothers is that they're sort of cautious of folks who want to come in and sort of engage in sort of a saviorist ideology or a saviorist position, but are really looking for folks to partner with and to really think about, because especially communities who have been harmed by particular policies have a lot to say, have been thinking for a long time about solutions to some of the issues that really impact them. And so they're looking to build partnerships with folks, and with folks with particular kinds of skills. So my biggest advice is you think about, how do we go out and do action? How are we also looking to partner? And in that partnership, being really mindful about those relationships. How does my positionality as someone maybe who's not from this community, how do I think deeply about my relationships and what role I can serve here? And I think we need everybody in the work. We need, I think movement building requires that we think of how each of us can contribute. But I would suggest that we think really deeply about how we form those relationships, especially if we're working with particular communities, right? To solve some of the biggest issues that we are facing today.
Catherine here. I would definitely second volunteering. I learned a lot from the various jobs that I did. I learned a lot from just interacting with people that I work with. So volunteering is a really great way in, you know, creating maps for your town or your city, or for any reason. It's just fantastic. If you read something on the news and it makes you want to think about what that is in time and space, you could create a story map. You could, you know, pull all sorts of articles in the news and share this. One of the ones that I'm interested in right now is I've been seeing these videos of the water level in the Lake Victoria increasing, and I was curious to think, wow, what does that look like from space? And that might be a really useful piece of information for when they're trying to figure out how to build back better, or help communities, people who have their infrastructure, houses damaged. So definitely volunteering, and then trying to learn new things. There's so many resources out there. There are these women in GIS groups. There are women who code, and there are all sorts of tutorials that you can begin as not an expert, but then can become an expert by the end of this really challenging, hard, complicated time. You might actually have a really excellent skill and have worked on a current problem that would help open up other doors for you to grow as a researcher, as a GIS expert, or a community worker. And I mean, that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. If we didn't get to your question, there was a couple that we definitely didn't get to. We'll pass along any specific questions to each one of the presenters that they're for. Or if you'd like to contact one of our presenters separately, there's contact information. Hopefully you're seeing it up on the screen right now. Again, I'd like to thank Catherine Nakalembe, Susan Wolfinbarger, Veronica Velez, and Rhiannan Price for spending time with us today and taking your time to educate us and to talk with us. And one thing I do want to mention is after the webinar, a survey will pop up. It's also going to be sent to you via email with a link to the recording. So this is recorded, so you can always watch it again or pass it along. But if you would take the time to give us feedback through this survey on your experience, we'd really appreciate it. We'd love to do this again in the future, so any suggestions you guys may have would be fantastic. Before I go, I just want to thank Madeline and Margot for their help behind the scenes. Definitely couldn't have happened without them here today. And a big thank you for everyone who joined us. Like I said, we would love to have another one of these very soon, so fill out your survey. And if you'd like to learn more about these women or the other many women out there using GIS, you can take a look at our book or books from Esri Press. We have Women in GIS Volume 2 and Volume 1, which has 23 great women in it as well. So again, thanks to everyone. Have a really safe and happy rest of your week.